We've talked about Lizzie's upbringing, we've talked about the money, and now we're stepping straight into the rising pressure inside the Borden home. Because before the axe ever swung, tension was already tightening like a coil.
Quiet resentment, simmering arguments, cold stares across the dinner table, the kind of things that don't make headlines but absolutely shape the path of a disaster. Today, we're going to trace back those cracks as they form, spread, and finally threaten to split this entire household apart. This is the episode where the atmosphere gets heavy and the stakes get real.
I'm Jimbo.
And I'm Dustin. And this is Dark Discoveries.
Welcome back to Dark Discoveries, and welcome to episode 3 of our deep exploration into the world of Lizzie Borden. So far, we've talked about her early life and the complicated emotional environment of the Borden home. Then, in episode 2, we broke down the financial landscape, the wealth that Andrew Borden accumulated, the way he controlled it, and how that control shaped the identities and frustrations of his daughters. Today, we step even deeper into the psychological labyrinth of that household. Because before the murders of Andrew and Abby in 1892, the home was already cracking under pressure. The resentments, the subtle conflicts, the silent feuds, all of these threads form a web that help us understand not only what might have motivated the crime, but how the household's atmosphere became so dark and suffocating that something catastrophic felt almost inevitable. Episode 3 is about tension, emotional, interpersonal, psychological, and environmental tension. By the time we finish this episode, the powder keg will be fully assembled, and in episode 4, we're going to light the fuse.
And that's the thing. People love to jump straight to the murder scene, the axe, the forensics, and the trial. But without understanding the emotional pressure cooker leading up to those events, you're missing the core of the case. The Borden home wasn't just a physical space. It was a psychological container with very few ways for anything or any way to escape. Lizzie, Emma, Andrew, and Abby were all living in this quiet storm of unspoken frustrations, disappointments, and suspicions. This episode is about mapping out that terrain. We're going to break down the conflicts within the house, the personal ones, the structural ones, and even see some of the strange patterns of behavior that became more pronounced in the months leading to the murders. If episodes 1 and 2 were the foundation, this is the level where things start to shift, to tremble, and to crack. So let's walk through that house again, this time with the lights dim and the tensions turned up.
So we're going to talk about the house divided, the growing rift between the family members. I mean, we've already seen some of that. Like I said, the onion layers being peeled off, the problems that they're having. And it all centers around what, Dustin? Money. So
Money.
Oh, no, here we go. So let's start with the layout of the Borden home. We're not talking about the architecture of how the house is actually set up, but the emotional geography. By the early 1890s, the home functioned less like a unified family household and more like two separate factions forced to share space. On the one side, you had Andrew and his wife, Abby. On the other side, you had Lizzie and Emma, united by blood and early childhood trauma, but increasingly bound together by resentment. The two groups lived parallel lives under the same roof, intersecting only when absolutely necessary. Meals were often taken separately. Interactions were brief, although they were polite, and they were strained. This wasn't a household where people enjoyed each other's company. It was a household where people endured each other. And Lizzie and Emma's resentment towards Abby, already established earlier in their life, continued to deepen. Abby wasn't just a stepmother they didn't like. She was perceived as an intruder into what they saw as their rightful inheritance.
And that distance wasn't just emotional, it was physical in a very strange way. The Borden home had a notoriously awkward floor plan with rooms that connected to each other, doors would lock in between sections, the awkward pathways that required navigating to somebody else's private space to get to your own. Privacy became a battlefield. Doors were locked, not for the safety, but as a symbolic boundary between emotional territories. The constant need to navigate those physical barriers reinforced the emotional walls already in place. And because the house lacked modernization, chores, tasks, and daily routines brought the family into contact with each other more than they would like. Contact that often would result in avoidance or stiffness rather than warmth. When you take a family already tiptoeing around unresolved tensions, the place seems to be more cramped. The outdated home that forces you within such close proximity is creating conditions where resentment can fester like mold in a damp room.
I mean, we're talking about, imagine just the stress. Imagine how Lizzie and Emma felt. You see their friends getting married. Their cousins are probably getting married. They're getting the inheritance when their parents die. And, it's got to be hard on them.
Yeah, like I said, but how many, they had friends outside, and I know we're going to get to that, but it just seems like they were so much kept away from the real world.
Right. They were sheltered.
Yep.
So let's talk about the emotional pressure on Lizzie for a moment. She was a woman without autonomy. So at the time leading up to the murders, Lizzie was 32 years old, well into adulthood by Victorian standards, yet still living at home with no personal income, no independent authority, and no ability to build a separate life for herself. So it's going to be hard for her to even get away if she has no money coming in. Society expected unmarried women to remain with their families until marriage. But in most wealthier households, the daughters enjoyed comforts and opportunities reflecting their family's financial status. Lizzie didn't get any of that. Her father's insistence on austerity meant she experienced none of the luxuries that other upper-class young women did. She couldn't host elaborate social gatherings, she couldn't travel freely, and couldn't express any kind of independent identity. The world was expanding for women in the late 1800s. Educational opportunities, social clubs, travel, and Lizzie was allowed glimpses into that world, but never a full participant. That kind of emotional limitation, especially for a woman with intellectual curiosity and a desire for autonomy, builds slowly but deeply.
And that emotional confinement carries a real psychological weight. When someone feels trapped, not physically, but in identity, opportunities, and self-expression, they start to transform internally. For some, the results is deep depression or retreat. For others, it results in defiance or symbolic forms of rebellion. But for Lizzie, it was way more complicated. She wasn't openly rebellious, yet she wasn't passive either. She existed in the middle ground where she followed the rules while quietly pushing against them in the ways that she could. She traveled occasionally. She shopped more than Andrew approved of, or I don't know if we're going to dive into it, or maybe shoplifted. She did get in trouble for that a few times, but because of the family's social stature, and with her dad being a professional businessman and out there and everybody knew him, they kind of swept it underneath the rug. So she made social connections outside the home. She dreamed, though, quietly of a life beyond 2nd Street. When these small acts of independence were denied or criticized, the disappointment hit harder because they represented her only outlets. And as the emotional atmosphere in the home grew darker, those limitations became sharper obstacles. Lizzie wasn't just an adult woman stuck at home. She was an adult living in a house where the emotional and financial climate was slowly crushing her.
I mean, Dustin, can you imagine being 32 years old, not a job, hardly any friends, and just trying to live your life?
Take the job away, and that's my life. So
right.
Just hanging out and not doing nothing.
Right. I mean, you can only read so many books, right?
Sure.
So
books.
let's talk about the resentment they had towards Abby, that they went from a distance to contempt. So we've talked about the relationship between Lizzie and Abby because this wasn't a simple case of mild stepmother resentment. The daughter's refusal to call her mother wasn't just a formality, it was ideology. To Lizzie and Emma, Abby was not a maternal figure and never would be. You know, you often see that a lot when parents get divorced, and you'll see one kid, you know, you have dad or mom, and then the other one is, hey, Roger, or hey, Tamara, or whatever, you know, they don't want to call them, you know, stepmom or mom or any of those other words. So every interaction between them was filtered through years of emotional distance. But as time passed and as financial decisions increasingly favored Abby's family, that distance transformed into something deeper. When Andrew gave that Whitehead house to Abby's sister, it wasn't about the value of the property. It was about symbolism and what it signaled. It signaled to Lizzie that Abby's family mattered more to Andrew than his own daughters. That act planted a seed of bitterness in Lizzie that only grew with time. She saw Abby not just as an outsider, but as someone absorbing the resources Lizzie believed were rightfully hers.
In a resentment like that, when left to mature unchecked, becomes contempt. You can hear it in contemporary accounts. Lizzie avoided Abby as much as possible. She refused to eat with her. She avoided conversations. She also avoided shared chores or tasks. You know, so anything that she could do, she tried to separate herself. The psychological boundaries that were hardening, and when the contempt enters the household relationship, it becomes extremely hard to reverse. Contempt isn't passive; it's corrosive. It reinterprets every interaction as a slight. It reframes every action as self-serving, whether Abby truly was manipulative or not. Lizzie's perceived her that way, and perception in a tense household becomes reality. By the time we reached the year of the murders, Lizzie reportedly hadn't spoke to Abby for months, except when absolutely necessary. That level of hostility, kept under a polite Victorian surface norm, becomes a pressure point for any theory regarding motive.
Can you imagine living in such a tiny house and not saying anything for months to your stepmom?
I want to know, like, what is tiny? Like, is it really tiny? Because I know I can look it up.
Well, it is a bed and breakfast house now, right?
Yeah, I need to, you know, Dark Discovery's road trip, I guess. But
so let's.
I mean, is it small in that standard, or is it small in today's standard? You know, so I'm guilty on that, but it's one of those, even in a normal size house today, if you're not getting along with somebody, you're going to cross paths more.
Right. But you got to remember they at least had a maid. And I think we read earlier where there were some servants. So did all those live there too?
I know just of the maid, but it's one of those, it just, like I said, you go back to how frugal they are, but you have a maid. So
right.
Just some things just aren't sitting with me, man. Still not sitting.
So we're going to talk about the mysterious theft, locked doors, and the growing paranoia. So we come to the incident that many historians point to as a critical turning point. The thefts within the household. Items went missing. Small valuables, trinkets, money. Andrew, already a cautious man, saw this as a violation of his personal space. Instead of addressing the issue through open communications, he responded by installing new locks on doors and cabinets throughout the home. The house became subdivided into zones of suspicion. These weren't conveniences, they were security measures, and in a household already tense with emotional divides, locks become symbolic weapons. Each door that closed reinforced the idea that someone inside the home couldn't be trusted. Imagine living in a home where the father suspects the daughters suspect the stepmother, and everyone feels watched. That kind of environment shifts you, your baseline psychological state. You're no longer living, you're bracing. So, Dustin, let me ask you a question. Do you think it was Lizzie and her sister stealing stuff to go pawn to get money? Do you think it was them just stealing stuff to make a statement? Do you think it was some of Abby's relatives or her cousins coming through? Do you think it was people that they invited into the house as guests that left with some of that? Do you think it was the maid or the servants that was stealing stuff? What do you think?
So the way the bedrooms are set up from where you're talking, I don't see it being a guest because it's going to be tough for them to get in those areas and not be seen. You know, you leave a room that you're not supposed to be in, you know, it just would be odd. It sounds, if you're just looking on the outside, not really diving in, and I don't think I have enough knowledge of really, really deep research on this myself to make it's this, but on the outside looking in, it seems like you have a 32 daughters that are in their 30s, still living at home, no boyfriends, no nothing. They're looking for a way out. They're going to be looking for an escape plan. So if you can get some money here and there, you can get some stuff of value, you can possibly scrape together enough to get out and get somewhere. But without a job and the way, you know, I don't know what jobs are out there for women in 1892. I don't know what your plan is once you get out, but I don't know if they're looking that far.
Or who else was living in the house at that time? The maids. If they seen the animosity and the hatred that I'm sure Libby would say something to the maid at a time about, oh, blah, 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 you know, gossip like they do. She could have done something where she took it where basically to help get rid of Lizzie. But we don't know. There is no proof of who took what. So we were just speculating at this time.
So if you're a maid and you get caught stealing, that word is going to spread pretty fast in that town. And your chance of getting a job being a maid again will probably be slim to none.
Right.
So I don't know if the maid would be that gutsy.
But I'm just saying she's one of the people that could go into those bedrooms and stuff and steal stuff without raising suspicion.
Yep. And you can, you know how stuff goes. It starts with something small and gets bigger and bigger as people get more courageous. Mm-hmm. So it's a possibility. I just don't think it's that high because when she gets kicked out, where's she going to go?
Same way where Lizzie's going to go if she gets caught.
Yeah, but, you know, you can always play it off on somebody else and, oh, I wouldn't do that. Why would I do that? You know, I live here. But like I said, there's suspicion and you know, you're locking everything up. You're going to start feeling, which I guess that's pretty good that he was a cabinet maker so at one point and he's made some coffins. So he's pretty handy at making stuff. So, you know, let's make some new cabinets and lock everything up. And so what's striking about this is how the locked door atmosphere intensifies the emotional isolation that's already dominating the house. Instead of sitting down to resolve mistrust, everybody retreated behind barriers, physically and emotional alike. This is where we start seeing the Borden home not just as dysfunctional, but it's fracturing. The theft incidents doesn't prove Lizzie was responsible, but the reaction to it says a lot about how fractured the family had become at this point. When you're so deeply suspicious of the people living under your own roof, you install locks all over the house. You're not dealing with a normal domestic tension anymore. You're dealing with paranoia. And paranoia doesn't sit well. It escalates. By the time I reached the events on August 4th, 1892, that paranoid tension had only grown, creating a household full of anxiety, silence, and suspicion. These emotions don't dissipate on their own. They just compound and get bigger and bigger and bigger.
So we're going to head into the summer of 1892, where there's illness, isolation, and impending disaster incoming. So as we move through the summer months of 1892, the tension in the Borden household reaches an all-time high. The daughters return from extended stay in New Bedford, but instead of bringing calm, the returns seem to amplify the distance between them and their parents. Let's face it, they probably got out and enjoyed the world. They had some space, probably had it at the time of their lives, and then, we got to go back home. The household dynamic was very brittle. And then came the strange wave of illness that struck the house in the days before the murders. Abby reported feeling sick. Andrew felt sick. Even the visiting uncle, John Morris, experienced discomfort. The only one who seemed relatively fine was Lizzie. People at that time speculated about spoiled food, contaminated milk, or even deliberate poisoning. Whether those suspicions were fair or not, they added another layer of tension to an already unstable home. Everyone was on edge, everyone felt uneasy, and the emotional landscape was primed for something explosive.
Explosive diarrhea, maybe. So you had the first bout of some food sickness, possibly. And then you have a couple days later, after the uncle leaves, it happens again. So I don't know if you dive into it any deeper, but the second time it was mutton broth, which just sounds so delicious. But you have to remember, this is a house. This is the late 1800s. Supposedly that stuff sat out overnight. So foodborne bacteria was a thing, as it is today. It didn't go nowhere. It didn't just come up out of nowhere. So leaving that out there, I could see, hey man, we were sick, and maybe I think it was like some type of swordfish stew before that maybe made them sick. And if you don't have great ways to store that food, especially like a broth, once it's cooked, if it sits out, it's, I don't even want to think about it.
So do you think that the maid cooked their food too? Or do you think she was just a cleaner?
I'm pretty sure she that job of the maids to cook and clean. But when you don't have refrigeration, and it doesn't, you'd think you'd eat more stuff that you would consume and not leave out for a few days and eat. So I don't know like I said, just the way things were. I haven't really dove into the food back then. You see some recipes, which we're going to cover something a little bit later, but I don't know what the practice was normal. Is it normal to eat on that stew for a couple days? Was the mutton maybe bad that's in that broth, already? I don't know. So this illness adds a strange psychological overtone for the final days. Whether it was food poisoning or something more sinister, the suspicion deepened the emotional gulf. Abby was anxious. Andrew was irritable. Morris was unsettled, the uncle. And Lizzie, according to some accounts, was still acting distant, withdrawn, but yet strangely energized. It was important to note that Victorian homes were often operated under harsh undertones when something felt wrong. People didn't talk openly about their fears. They whispered them. They internalized them, and they let them grow in silence. That's exactly what was happening in the Borden house. All the resentment, mistrust, locked doors, inheritance fears, and now illness came together to create a psychological climate that was volatile, toxic, and unpredictable. If the murders were a lightning strike in the summer of 1892, the storm cloud was thickening overhead.
So, Dustin, I do believe you have a recipe you would like to share with the audience for Lizzie Borden's meatloaf. So, Dustin, why don't you go ahead?
I don't know if I would really want to eat it, but this comes from the Falls River Historical Society. So Lizzie's version is 1 pound of steak, which I'm assuming they ground, half a pound of pork sausage or pork steak, 1 egg and 1 small onion. It says 3 soda crackers, salt, herbs, pepper. Kind of your basic, it's good to see that meatloaf stays about the same over the last 150 years. You grease the tin, cover the loaf with hot water, and bake for an entire hour. Sounds a little odd when you talk about grease the tin, cover the loaf. So you're going to wrap it in aluminum foil, and you just do your best to submerge it and boil it in the aluminum foil.
Well, no, it's kind of like a pot roast where you dump water on top or whatever, and you put it in there to bake. So you're putting that in there to kind of put the moisture around the meatloaf, I would say. And then as you're baking it, it probably cooks it.
Makes it.
Yeah.
You just think they'd have a way, because they had they had big steel stoves back then that you could put it in like an oven type thing or put it in a cast iron skillet, a Dutch oven. But hey, more power to you. Sounds like you maybe cooked more over an open fire, kind of in the fireplace still. But the mystery of why you would do that will continue to live on. So
is that all that you just put in there for an hour? Is that it?
That's what it says. And there's no temperatures.
And then you die from food poisoning.
Food safety was not a thing in the 1890s. But this was also featured in a cookbook. If you guys are interested, it's called Food to Die For. So if you want to,
not food to make you die, right? Leave this mutton out for 48 hours.
I want to be very, very thorough when I say this, that there is no arsenic or any poison within this recipe. So you can eat it and, don't worry about dying, but you could probably just do it more modern, which I would highly recommend.
So as we get down to the end of this episode, let's talk about the storm before the strike. So by the time we conclude this episode, we've assembled the pressure box that would eventually explode into one of America's most infamous crimes. The family was divided by resentment, separated by mistrust, and slowly suffocating under the weight of a strict authority, limited autonomy, and emotional stagnation. Understanding the Borden household in the lead up to the murders is essential for understanding any of the theories that we're going to talk about in future episodes. Whether Lizzie was guilty, innocent, or somewhere in between in the gray spaces, the house wasn't just a crime scene waiting to happen. It was a psychological trap, and the people inside were running out of emotional exits.
Into the next episode, we're going to dive straight into the fire. The murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. The timeline, the forensic evidence, the contradictions, the alibis, and the strange behaviors witnessed in the hours before and after the killings. This is where the myth and the mysteries collide. We'll walk through every known detail step by step to understand how two murders could take place in a small house with multiple people inside and around, and no one claimed to hear a thing. Episode 4 is the hinge point of the entire series, where the story shifts from a psychological buildup to the brutal reality. You won't want to miss it. And as always, remember, the deeper you dive,
the darker it gets.